Well, welcome everyone to the first virtual Boston Marathon Expo. I'm Tom Gilligan, CEO and founder of Marathon Tours and Travel back in 1979 during the first running boom. And we're delighted to have as our guest Roger Robinson, who has had a long career of, I'm guessing over 60 years now in the sport. First as an athlete, world class, and then later on as a journalist, lecturer, writer, film producer, and more or less the unofficial historian for the sport, since your latest book was called When Running Made History. Now, Roger, because we're talking to a lot of people who are, let's say, newbies for the Boston Marathon, your name probably doesn't ring a bell, but your competitive career was quite impressive. Can you give us a quick synopsis of your early days? Because what was interesting about your background is you ran both for the British team, since you were a professor of English literature with a PhD from Cambridge University. So you made the UK national team. And when was that?
Oh, that was 1966, when I was in my mid-20s, Tom. If people wanted to see my name in Boston, they could go and crawl around the square there by the finish line, around Copley Square, and the Boston Marathon Memorial. A lot of people miss it, but it's actually a very good memorial engraved in the stone of the paving in the square, right up near the finish line. And there's a map of the course, and then going around are the names of all the past winners. And fortunately, they included the Masters winners. And so my name is there as the Masters winner in 1984, along with every other winner, male, female, Masters, and in recent years, wheelchair. It's well worth a visit if you're in Boston. But of course, most of your people are virtual, but when they get a chance, they should go there.
Now, in 84, you won the Masters. 49 then?
My age was, I was 44.
44.
I was 44. I won the Masters and set a Masters record. And that was my first run at the Boston Marathon. I hadn't run many marathons. Just backing up, I ran for England in 66, having been a fairly modest college level runner, but just kept improving. And I have I'm a late developer and very persistent, Tom. So you relate to that. And ran for England in 66. Then, for career reasons and personal reasons, moved from England to New Zealand because it looked a good place to work in a university career, and combine that with some running, which I did. And then, as you said, I managed 10 years later, 1977, in fact, to run for New Zealand in the World Championships. At that time, I hadn't run a marathon, because the focus of my running, and most people's running in England and New Zealand, was cross-country, track, road races, 10 miles. The big event every year was the national cross-country. And this is how things changed. And you'd remember this. When you met a runner, like you and I might have met back in the 1950s or 60s. And what you want to know from the other runner is, what's your best place in the national championship? What's your best cross-country place? Or what's your best 10K or 6-mile track time? Then round about late 1970s, after the 76 New York Marathon, and as Boston's fields got bigger and bigger, when you met anybody, especially in America, the first question was, what's your best marathon time? And I didn't have one. When I was first in America in 1980, I'd never run a marathon, and I was 41 years old. So I set to and ran the New York Marathon, and then I felt I was respectable. I had some credentials to present. It was like walking around, half naked without a marathon time in those days. And then I ran the first chance I got to run Boston from that distance was in 1984. And the reason, Tom, was that it was at Easter. So I could sneak away from Wellington, New Zealand, jump on a plane, fly to Boston, run the Boston Marathon, jump on the plane and fly back. And I was dean of humanities in the university at that time, and I had to get special permission to miss one meeting. And the vice chancellor, that's like the president of the university, was a good-humored guy, and he said, "Yes, well, you can miss that meeting provided you run the Boston Marathon wearing your Victoria University singlet." So I did, which gave one of the best comments ever when I was coming through Kenmore Square, and somebody leaned out from the crowd and he said, "Go Victoria, foist woman."
Yeah,
So I,
typical
you know,
Boston. Yeah.
despite my beard and bald head, you know, I got credit for being the first woman because of having Victoria on my shirt. So that was my first Boston Marathon, and I set the Masters record, which was 2:20. It got broken since, but I like to say I was the fastest non-professional to run Masters in the Boston Marathon.
And then thereafter, you also won 50 and over and set the 50 and over record.
Not at Boston. I set the 50 and over record at New York.
Okay.
Ran 2:28 at New York.
Right.
But I couldn't run. Boston was, because I was still based in New Zealand at that time, you know, it took a special effort to get away for these American races. I could get away to some races in July because that was a mid-year break and so on. But it was, I always had to pick it as to which races I could get to.
Now, speaking of New Zealand, you're currently in New Zealand with Catherine, relaxing, I suppose, and doing what you can do in isolation. But New Zealand, thanks to your Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern,
Yes.
wonderful job.
Yeah. Well, that's what we think, and we're still alive, unlike several hundred thousand in other countries. And they're taking measures to control the virus, and it's highly developed contact tracing. My son is involved in that. He's a techie character, very good at software, and he's involved in this very complex process of contact tracing. And they're also doing genome testing, and so they're controlling each. If there is an outbreak, they can track it and control it. And everywhere we go, you take your cell phone and you have a contact app on the cell phone. We go to the supermarket or go into a cinema or get a bus, wherever you go, just go to playing fields to train. And there's a board there with a barcode. You hold your phone up against the barcode and it's recorded where you are. So they've got this whole system so that if there's an outbreak, they can track people down.
Yeah, with such a small country, I suppose it's far more easy to get
It
something.
is. It's easier, of course. Yeah.
You know, with 4.88 million people, it's smaller than the population of Massachusetts, which makes it all the more impressive that at one time, the top 40 and over, the top 50 and over, and the top 60 and over marathoners in the world were all from New Zealand, because you had John Campbell, who had run 2:11, who had in Boston set the world record. You were ranked number 1 50 and over, I believe.
That's true. Yeah.
Then you had Derek Turnbull, who was ranked number 1 60 and over.
60 and over. Yeah.
What do you attribute all of that to?
I think New Zealand is a place, because it's so remote and it has a small population, people just do things, and they know that often it will take a lot of work. And so one simple way of putting it is there's no point in sitting here in Wellington and waiting for the New York Symphony Orchestra to come, because they never will. So you have to create your own music, and they do it at a high standard. And that's very much the case in running. And so you get innovative people like the coach Arthur Lydiard, or like going back a bit further, Jack Lovelock in the 1930s, and then Arthur Lydiard, working out ways of training, developing it, and building a whole group. And people work very well together, as they've done during this COVID-19 virus crisis. The nation has worked well together. And people work well in groups while it's a very individualistic country. So ideas can develop and you get groups working. And certainly the depth in running, when I first arrived here, New Zealand was in a slight dip when I first arrived, because we'd had the Snell Halberg era, and then up came the Quacks, Dixon, Walker era. And then with all the top women, of course, Lorraine Moller and Anne Ordain, Alison Rowe, and that whole era. And that all happened in the mid-1970s. So I was really part of that. I was a bit older than most of them, but very close to them and very much part of that scene.
And they were all a big part of the Boston Marathon. At Dixon, I don't think Rod ever ran Boston.
No, not Boston. I don't think.
Of course,
No.
Allison Rowe came upon the scene and won Boston and won New York during the same year. She
Mm.
had the world record for a bit. And I'll never forget, I lived with Dave McGilvey, the race director, and three other runners out on the course out in Wellesley. And Allison was out staying with some friends in Wellesley and training on the course in preparation for the event. She was out, she came up early for about 3 weeks to train. And everybody, she came over to our house for a pre-race party, and everyone was asking, who is this tall, good-looking, blonde New Zealand runner? And lo and behold, a couple days later, everyone found out who she was, as she was one of the smoothest runners you'd ever imagine.
Yeah, I write about her as the warrior goddess. I mean, she just is like the sort of warrior queen figure because she was so powerful and beautiful, and she's still around. She was talking the other day about a new book that somebody's done on New Zealand running, and Alison is still very much part of the scene. And the year I won the Masters at Boston in '84, Lorraine Moller won the women. So we had a nice double that day. And the tradition goes back because the year when my wife, Catherine Switzer, was famously attacked by Jock Semple, the race director, 1967, the race was actually won that day by a New Zealander who nobody in Boston had heard of, called Dave Mackenzie. Little guy who set print for the local newspaper on the West Coast, absolutely as remote as you could get. And he's another one who trained in the rain and the wind and all the weather that they get on the West Coast. So Boston, on a bad day, which it was in 1967, had no surprises for him. He handled it and set a course record, run 2:15. So he's another good friend, and again part of that whole Kiwi tradition.
Yes, I had Rod Dixon living with me last summer for about 3 or 4 weeks here in Boston when he was having some work done at the cardiology department of Mass General Hospital. And in the evening, you know, over dinner, he would just tell me lots of great stories of his days with Dick Quacks and John Walker when the sport was just becoming professionalized and they were just able to, well, they were taking money under the table or they would be given running shoes and they'd sell them to make a little bit of money because in those days it was a struggle to be an athlete and to be competitive without having to work full time.
Yeah, I wrote an article for the Cascade Runoff program back in about 80 or 79, something like that. No, a bit later, called Vikings of the Pacific. And it was about the New Zealand runners who were going over to America at that time and winning all the races and drinking all the beer and seducing all the women and or the other way around, all the men, and just going over and having a great time and making the best of those early years when the sport was just tipping over into professionalism, with a lot of the kind of innovativeness and slightly kind of maverick spirit that New Zealanders have.
Yes, in fact, there was a book written called The Quotable Runner by Mark Will Weather, who was a columnist for Runner's World. And in it, he quoted Rod Dixon as saying, "All I've ever wanted to do was drink beer and run like hell."
Train like an animal. Yes, train like an animal, drink beer. That about describes it. Yes. Rod's, of course, he's become a lot broader than that with what he's doing with his children's marathon, kids marathon charity, and doing some great stuff. But yeah, there was and is that spirit, and it's still very strong. Talk to anybody. I mean, if you read accounts of World War II, the New Zealand Flyers were regarded as crazy men because they would take risks that others wouldn't take, and that spirit is still there in the running. You know, people are innovative. I've got a story for you, Tom. Another first. At a race, it was going to be the New Zealand Cross Country Championships on Saturday, and it couldn't be the championship because the Auckland team couldn't come because of virus restrictions. So it was just called the Challenge. And one runner who was a double Olympian was running in the over 50 Masters race, and he was disqualified for spitting.
I saw the news release. on
I
that.
think that's probably the first runner in the history of running. As a historian, I'm fascinated. Probably the first runner in the history of running to be disqualified for spitting. So beware if you're running your virtual marathon and you're in a state or a place where spitting in public streets is forbidden for health and safety reasons because of the virus. Beware, you might get jumped on and arrested.
Well, I think we've gone a little bit too far. Spitting becomes illegal.
Well,
Yeah. So, Rogers, what's next for you? I'm sure you're quite disappointed you weren't in Boston in April, as you and Catherine always are, covering the
well, we
race.
really miss it. Yeah. We miss the running circuit. Normally at this time of year, we would be on our way to Berlin. And I already had the deal back at the beginning of the year that I'd be covering Berlin for Runners World. And so it is a disappointment. But like the rest of the world, we've just got to make the most of it. I've finished another book, and that went off to a publisher a few days ago, and I'm starting the next one. And Catherine's busy interviewing people and being interviewed and doing a lot of podcast work, that kind of thing. So no, we keep busy, but of course we miss that scene and we miss our friends. I coach two or three guys in Newport's, New York, where we live, and one of those I'm just working on his training schedule for the virtual Utica Boilermaker, which he's going to run.
Okay. Yeah.
Another virtual race. He's going to do that next week. And then he was entered for the Chicago Marathon, so he might run the virtual Chicago. I don't know. We haven't decided that yet, but and what we're so we're still working. And the great advantage of being a writer is that you can keep writing. You don't need the audiences. They're kind of a bonus.
Yeah. Well, Roger, hopefully we'll get to see each other sooner rather than later. There is some hope. September 20, there's an Athens half marathon with 10,000 runners. The race director, Marcus Simopoulos, who was the director of the Athens Olympics, and he's also the director of the Athens Marathon, second weekend in November, has come up with a protocol of how to have social distancing at the start, how you have 2 waves of 5,000 and you spread the start out every 8 seconds. You have 10 runners starting. It's quite clever. And they're going to do a test run in September. And we wish them lots of success, because if that works, then Athens could be the first major marathon.
Yeah. I've been saying this all year, Tom, that running was built by people like you, if you like, at building the business in the 1970s on what I've always called creative energy. And I think this is a time in this crisis, we've got to show that creative energy again. The event that I went to that I just told you of in Dunedin in New Zealand, that was similar. It wasn't a huge field, but the total of several hundred runners, but they divided up into races so that there were never more than 100 in any one race. The spectators were controlled, the protocol there, so that in the main pen area for the spectators, there were never more than 100 people, and somebody was checking us in and out. Social distance, medal ceremonies. The athletes stepped up onto the dais, put their own medals around their neck, and shook hands with an imaginary person. So these are the kind of changes and protocol. We just need to think it through. And what your person in Athens is doing is really important. I think our sport can do it. We're outdoors. If we think it through, we can actually restructure the sport and make it work.
Well, let's wish them lots of luck, and let's hope we all get back to our new normal running, if you want to call it that. But yeah, let's just hope and pray that we'll get back there and get out on the roads. And the one big takeaway that everyone experiences in our sport is the camaraderie. And it's virtual camaraderie is not the same as just being face to face and elbow to elbow with fellow runners.
That's true, and obviously it's a real problem for your business. The positive is that also essential to running is that sheer process of going out and just doing it and getting what I call getting onto the earth. And you can do that alone for some time and get the pleasures of that. And then the camaraderie is the other part of it. And certainly we miss that. And organizations like yours have always helped to make that happen. So look forward to it.
Roger, those are very kind words, and thank you so much for your time. Stay safe down in New Zealand, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Tom. And all those who are running the virtual Boston Marathon, run virtually well and enjoy it. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.